Jingawala. Welcome to Tales of the Tweed. My name is Arabella Douglas. It's Wednesday morning. I'm here every Wednesday morning at 10:30 to talk about the history of the Tweed from an indigenous perspective and to talk about the cultural community around the Tweed. As we have just celebrated Anzac Day, I thought it only appropriate to talk through with you today some of the sites that connect to World War I, World War II, and of course, predating those wars, the frontier wars of the area. I thought that I would share with you, for those that actually reside in the Tweed, some history about some of the areas that are accessible but perhaps not as identified or easily identified that relate to the war. One of those areas is in Fingal Head called Woman Bay, and for those that don't know where that is, as you come down to Fingal Strait, there are some culverts along the way, and if you take one to the right, you'll get to a Woman Bay area at the back, which then butts up against the beach at the back of Fingal. What's so interesting about that area and all through that site, which kind of links, if you follow it south, it kind of links to the back of Chindra, is that area was actually the site for an African American hospital and a camp in World War II. And you might be thinking, well, why did we have an African American camp all the way down in Fingal in World War II? Good question. The reason that occurred is because when World War II was upon us in Australia, we also practiced what is commonly known as the White Australia policy. And a man by the name of Kim Beazley's father, actually, for those that are old enough to remember who Kim Beazley is, was in fact the Minister for Defence and had to usher through an urgent piece of legislation at the time of the war, which allowed African American soldiers who were enrolled as US soldiers into Australia to help defend and protect Australia at the time. But because of the White Australia policy, it also meant that people who were dark-skinned and black-skinned people were already operating differently. Even in the Tweed, we had segregated areas, including the cinema at Coolangatta at one point. So when they knew that they were going to have a number of African-American soldiers in Australia's shores to participate in the war, they were obviously aware and conscious that they would need to create a hospital and a base, because the hospitals, which were all through Queensland and obviously in New South Wales, but predominantly in Brisbane where activity was happening further north, were in fact segregated spaces. So they decided, because Fingal Head was known back then as a coloured community or a community of colour, that they would erect a hospital, a temporary military hospital just outside of Fingal Head, and that's the area in Woman Bay. So there is a small sign or a plaque along the river. You kind of miss it, it's so small, that does talk about this history. But what's important is also to understand that meant that for a period of time, African American soldiers who were recovering from injury in the war were a part of the Fingal Head Aboriginal community. And in fact, you have people in the Tweed who have partnered, married. Women have gone overseas after meeting somebody there, after meeting somebody in that community. And we also have a number of people in the Tweed community who share both African American history, our heritage, biologically, and also Aboriginal heritage. So they participated in that camp at Woman Bay. They would come down to the church, which has always been in Fingal Head since around 1911, which is at Letitia Road, Fingal Head. They would come down, share the church service. I know people in the community have small Bibles that were given by the chaplain, who was also an American soldier, who was then stationed and would care for the men as they would recover from injury. But I guess what people in the Tweed don't realise is that the bonding of those communities, so the bonding of African American soldiers in World War II with the Aboriginal communities in the area, was very real, and we've maintained those relationships. So you may have been aware that Aboriginal people were also enlisted in every formal war that has ever happened. So that's every time a so-called Australian soldier has participated globally, Aboriginal people have been a part of that resistance, but you also may not be aware that there are a number of sites in the area that talk about the frontier resistance, and that is the interaction between non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people who fought over land. There are a number of sites in the area and in the district that talk about these frontier wars. There's some signage. There isn't enough signage for people to have a very good operation and understanding of it. But certainly, as people were coming into the Tweed from about 1830, 1840, and certainly between 1850 there's great activity. There are a number of sites as far as Lismore that you could easily go to visit. There are some just down towards Wooyong. There are some that go into Burringbar. There are sites of conflict that talk about the frontier wars. There's a great book called The Black Diggers, which I highly recommend to people, and it talks about Aboriginal participation in the former wars. It's called The Black Diggers, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in the Second World War. But in that book, they also talk about World War One, and they talk about black GIs in Australia as well, which is a very interesting experience for other soldiers that came into Australia at the time that was practicing segregation. I think the most interesting thing about war, and I guess there's a lot of people talking about China this week as well, and what's happening in China and Australia, we have a long psychological shift between Asia and Australia, and how that affects Aboriginal people is very interesting to observe and to understand as well. In the wartime, in World War II, it represented a new era in Australia for race relations, which is extremely interesting because Indigenous men and women attest to the fact for the first time in their life that they didn't experience any personal racism. There's another really interesting book called The Embarrassing Australia, The Story of an Aboriginal Warrior. Highly recommend. But the reason that they attest to not having racism directed at them is because when you're in a time of war, there was diminished personal racism among people who were in combat, service men and women in combat. And this has been also identified in the service of Africans, in African American service persons as well. So basically what I am sharing with you is that when a war has occurred, because there's a phenomenon called a collective enemy, it means that we're more likely to give up our personal and diminished racist views of each other. You have a collective enemy, and so Aboriginal people for the first time in wars, both in World War I and in World War II, report experiencing a diminished sense of personal attack against them because the collective enemy was the enemy of the war. And that's a very interesting phenomenon around warlike activities that I don't think people talk about. So I think the fact that as an individual, when you're fighting a collective enemy, you can feel relief by being unified behind team colours and a more collective agenda is a very real psychological shift. It also is very interesting because it tells you that you can uplift diminished racism against each other when you have a collective focus, and that is a real necessity both in war when you need a collective and unionised focus, but it also means that we could have those approaches when we're in non-war. So I think sharing for today, and again to honour Anzac Day and all those people, so both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who participate in all wars, is to first educate ourselves about the frontier wars that were prevalent all through this state and all through the Tweed and all through southeast Queensland, and that are accessible for you to visit and learn about. There's interesting warrior information available in books and libraries now about Aboriginal warriors and about Aboriginal resistance, both in Queensland and in New South Wales. There's also an excellent book called Invasion to Embassy by Heather Goodall, which is really interesting for those that are interested in military participation. But the sharing for today is this, that the Tweed is alive with the history of how conflict both affects us and the psychological and the racial impact of that in the time of the day. It is worth exploring those ideas and exploring that information with your family and your children. It's worth exploring how history of racism impacted participation in war, and it's certainly worth exploring Woman Bay and having a look at the African American camp to start to reimagine the Tweed and the history that built it. I hope you've enjoyed today's series on Aboriginal participation and racism in war as we learn and honour more about those that serve in war. I hope you've given some thought to the phenomenon of a collective enemy, because potentially collectively we can also decide not to have a collective enemy, but to have a collective decision about how it is that we can diminish personal racism against each other, but also collectively come together for a greater cause than ourselves. My name is Arabella. I am here every Wednesday, 101.3, Tales of the Tweed. I'm excited to be with you here every Wednesday. If you have any questions for me, please feel free to email the radio station and ask. I hope you have an outstanding day, Boogle Bear, and I will see you next week.